feeding into this is the concept known as predictive coding. And this helps us to understand why polarized perceptions generate such a big reaction. So we're going to look at the predictive coding model of the brain and how this model of the brain helps us to understand why it's so important from your brain's perspective that you actually resolve trauma and actually learn how to neutralize those emotional charges. So, predictive coding is a model of brain function, and it suggests that every single action we do, so whether that's digestion or the immune system working, movement, thoughts, emotions, they all consume energy. And so, therefore, they require energy to run. And because every action we do requires energy, the brain therefore has to constantly predict what are the possible energy costs of what we're going to be doing, and it needs to be able to essentially budget how much energy we're going to need in order to do a certain task, as well as maintain the really tight controls that the body needs to stay alive and function. So I mentioned budgeting. We can essentially think about it as your monthly budget. So at the beginning of the month, you might allocate some money for your shopping, you might allocate some money for your rent, and then for some new clothes. And in order to get things to run successfully, you need to budget those in advance and make predictions about what you're going to spend and where. So this is kind of how predictive coding in the brain works. It's all about making forecasts for the future so the brain can predict how much energy it requires. And this means what the brain is actually trying to do is avoid any unplanned or unpleasant surprises. So if we go back to our budgeting analogy, if you've planned your rent money, your shopping money, your food budget, and then all of a sudden you get a very unexpected large water bill, this is an unpleasant surprise, which can then throw off all of the other areas because all of a sudden your budget is out the window. So that's why we can think of the brain as wanting to predict things accurately and wanting to avoid unpleasant surprises. Because if your brain isn't able to provide the energy for the task that you're doing and achieve all of those other functions and those tight controls, something's going to give. So the more accurately your brain can predict events and experiences, the more you'll experience a stable, pleasant, familiar feeling. So if you've ever been working diligently on a task that you've really enjoyed, it's partially because your brain knows what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how much energy it will require. So you get that pleasant, stable feeling. So the more we understand how our mind works and how our perceptions work and what our values are, and we understand how polarized perceptions can knock us off kilter, the more we understand that the greater accuracy with which we can predict the world, the more stable we'll feel internally and the more balanced our emotions will be. In addition to this, we can notice and interpret and identify our internal sensations with greater accuracy because we're feeling more stable. We've got a stronger foundation, a stronger baseline. And because when we can label what we're going through the process of interoception, so we're paying attention to our internal signals, this is known as emotional granularity, so being able to label that I feel stressed or irritated or angry, that also helps us to predict our energy expenditure. Now, alongside this predictive coding element, the neuroscientist Carl Friston also applied the principle of free energy. So free energy is a label for something that's generated within the nervous system when a prediction error occurs. So just like we talked about before, if you can predict something accurately, then you have a familiar feeling. That means your prediction is in line with reality. When there is a prediction error, so your forecasting is inaccurate, this creates free energy. And this free energy is what leads to the dysregulation of the nervous system, or the HPA axis, as we talked about previously. So essentially, we can think about the more free energy there is in the nervous system, the lower the brain's ability to successfully distribute energy resources and coordinate internal activities, and so some functions start to lose their efficiency. And for example, when the immune system is running efficiently, everything is wonderful. But if there's a lack of energy and resources, then that might cause us some issues. Now, when we have an increase in free energy, so when there is a prediction error, this is experienced by us as feelings of uncertainty. And the name for this uncertainty is, essentially anxiety, and it's more formally known as psychological entropy, but it's that feeling of unease. And from a more formal definition, entropy is a measure of how much disorder there is within a system. So the more anxiety we have, the more disordered our system, and so the more disordered our thoughts, feelings, and emotions. Now, the challenge for the body, for example, is that it's trying to distribute all of these resources to regulate the system, to predict what we need. And so when there is more psychological entropy, when there is more anxiety in the system, this creates more internal chaos and disorder. So in order for the brain to make a prediction, it has to have a model of the world on which to go by. And this is really kind of the crux of what we're getting to. So the brain makes its predictions based on its model of the world. And its model of the world is generated by the accumulation of the experiences that we've had. So, for example, during those first 7 years of life, our brain is continually monitoring all of our experiences, and it's looking for statistical connections between events. So how often do we have certain types of experiences compared to others? And the more data the brain collects, the more it can generate a coherent model of how the world works. So this is hugely important for us because it means our perception of our past experiences is what helps us to shape our predictions of our future. And so when the brain is making these predictions, it's using those past experiences to make our future predictions. And if our past experiences, which for many people are based on events or experiences that are negatively charged or have strong emotional connections to them in a negative sense, that means that our brain is then going to predict more negative events and circumstances into the future, which then means it triggers more hypervigilance, it triggers more activity to look for threats, and all of this affects our ability to make and allocate the resources that we have. And so if our prediction is inaccurate, so we get a prediction error, we create that free energy, which leads to anxiety. And so when our past experiences are swayed towards negative judgments, then we make more negative predictions for the future. And so this has really strong implications for our well-being, because if we don't neutralize those previous emotional charges, then our brain will continue to generate negative predictions because we've still got those negative past experiences as the source of the data. So predictive coding is a little bit more on the complex side, but the key dynamic for us is that the brain wants to predict how much energy it needs. When it's able to do this, we feel pleasant and stable. When it's unable to do this, we feel more anxious. Our brain uses our past experiences to generate a model of the world. And so if our past experiences are negative, it will then predict more negative events in the future. And therefore, our stress response is activated more than we maybe need it to. So a little bit more of a complex topic, but a really important one.